Welcome to Series 2 of my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. I'm Smita Tharoor. In Series 1, I had the great privilege of hearing stories of unconscious bias from some wonderful people about a wide range of topics. I laughed, cried, and was moved in equal measure. I started this series because I wanted the listeners to realize that we are not alone. All of us have similar stories. They may not be the exact same, but when we hear them, we can hear the parallels in our lives. My speakers have all shared their learning and how they manage their unconscious biases, which is also a wonderful life lesson for us. Series 2 will follow the same style of interview. I hope you enjoy listening. Thank you so very much for joining this conversation with me to talk and explore unconscious bias. Listeners, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Ghida Ibrahim. Having lived and worked in 5 countries, Dr. Ghida Ibrahim is a global citizen with many hats: a technologist, a data scientist, a tech for good entrepreneur, a community builder, a lecturer, a speaker who's appeared on TEDx, a World Economic Forum appointed domain expert, and, if that's not enough, when the occasion allows, a stand-up comedian. That's so amazing. Ghida, thank you so very much for joining this conversation on the unconscious bias.
Thank you so much, Smita, for having me.
So, as we're talking about unconscious bias, I thought we should set the scene first by just looking at these 2 words.
Yes.
What do you understand by these 2 words, unconscious bias?
Yes. So I think unconscious bias, as you mentioned, 2 words, unconscious and bias. In my opinion, unconscious bias is kind of an opinion, not necessarily rooted in facts, that an individual or a group of people have about a person in particular, or more often, it's about a community that has something in common. So this something in common could be same culture, same religion, same ethnicity. It could be also like a given profession, like having a bias against lawyers, let's say, or something like that. And it's unconscious because like people are not aware that it's an opinion. It's not necessarily rooted in facts. They think that what they're expressing or like their opinion towards this person or this community is actually factual, which often it isn't. And it can be a one-to-one, it can be a one-to-many, and it could be, in most cases, many-to-many. So like many communities or many people have an opinion against like another group of people which represent a different community. And often these things come out of ignorance of the other, I would say.
That's brilliant. And in fact, it can be even something much smaller than communities. It could even be perhaps a football team.
Yeah.
Not that I am a football follower, but you know, perhaps you love Manchester United and I love Arsenal. And
Yeah.
based on just that, I don't have a very high opinion of you as a person, purely because you don't follow the same football team that I do.
Yeah.
So that's a brilliant example. And certainly a lot of research has been done on that and how we as groups, because we feel safe in our own groups, we group together and then make assumptions, either good or bad,
Yeah.
about some other group, which is very interesting. And in fact, just to continue that, you know, when I was reading out your introduction, the word that stood out for me, other than, of course, the incredible accomplishments that you've already had and continue to have, were the 2 words global citizen. Now, I certainly see myself as a global citizen, but it was interesting because often, you know, I have had the privilege of traveling in different parts of the world, and very often we can have what we call the taxi driver conversation. So they say, "Where are you from?"
Mm.
And I have lived in London for 30 years,
Yeah.
but instinctively my answer is always India.
Yeah.
And then some taxi driver might say, "So which part of India are you from?" And I always say Kerala.
Yeah.
This was very interesting because I have never lived in Kerala. I have been brought up in India, in Bombay and Calcutta and Rajasthan and Delhi,
Yeah.
and never lived in Kerala for more than 1 month at any stretch. Yet there was an unconscious, instinctive, implicit reaction that I hadn't given a second thought to when a stranger was saying, "Where do you come from?" So that began to make me think about identity and unconscious biases around identity. And yes, I see myself as a global citizen like you do. But yet, here was my answer when I was asked that question. So, when you're
Yeah.
hearing stories like this, Gita, what kind of stories come to your mind?
So like I've been in similar situations, and I feel like I also maybe subjected others to similar situations. So like I would be meeting a taxi driver or an Uber driver, and I would ask this person, so where are you from? And this person would tell me, oh, I'm from London. And sometimes I find myself asking, no, but originally where are you from? And then I realized, like, no, this is a very wrong question. Like, this person probably like grew up in London or lived most of their life in London, so they are truly a Londoner. And I think like similar thing has happened to me. Like, I grew up in Lebanon, so like my home is Lebanon. Obviously, I moved to France when I was 19 for studies, and at some point I became a French citizen. But I still always got this question, like, yeah, like, you're not really French, where are you originally from? You have like some accent. And like I kind of never fully felt like I am considered as a fully French person. But then I realized that many other people who grew up in France, but are not originally, like their parents, let's say, or their grandparents are not originally from there, are still being considered by the vast majority as not fully French. So this is like a part of the unconscious bias that manifests itself. And not only like France was one example, but I think we kind of encounter this kind of situation everywhere.
Absolutely. Yes, you're so right. I mean, but so tell us a little bit more, Gita, because you've had some exceptional, unusual circumstances, and forgive me for sounding slightly patronizing, and I don't mean to, but you are also very young. If I'm correct, you are only 32 years old, and you have already achieved as much as you have in a very short period of time. So tell us a little bit more about your experiences of when you left at the age of 19, and what kind of unconscious biases either you may have experienced from somebody else or perhaps you yourself had. Let's hear a little bit more about your stories and unconscious bias.
Yes, thank you, Smita. I mean, I feel like I don't like to look at my life in terms of achievement. It's more of like an experiment, and I think I've been very privileged to give myself the freedom to experiment, and it opened the door to many things beyond, actually experiment beyond biases. That's what I would invite your audience to do. So, coming back to your question, Smita. So I feel like the first bias that I kind of like started encountering was still like when I was still in Lebanon. So, like Lebanon is a very small country, but it's a very diverse country. We have almost like 18 religions or sects within religions. And it's kind of a very fortunate situation because you grow up in many communities, and you don't know, like I grew up in a very like kind of like agnostic house. And we were always told that religion is being a good human being. And then like this was really like, for me, religion was humanity and the basic human decency. That was it. But when I started uni and I did my first like years of uni in Lebanon, I went into another part of the country, and there I started experiencing some kind of biases that were based on some perception of my religion or the religion that I was born into, independently of whether I was practicing this religion or not. So this was like the first kind of like biases I encountered around like how women should look like in a given religion. This was the first thing. And then the second thing was when I moved to France. And of course there are like a lot of biases against like this immigrant coming from the Middle East. They have all these kind of like assumptions that maybe you were oppressed where you are, when in reality I was not oppressed at all. And I was very fortunate to grow up in a family that was so supportive of my dreams and of me like getting better and better in life. Actually, I made a stand up around my mom and dad being a little bit protected in the sense that they didn't want me to get into very serious relationships very young, because they wanted me to kind of be free and accomplish whatever I could accomplish, and basically build my own identity before being shaped by someone else's identity very early in life. So I felt like there was some kind of like bias there, and I had always to justify as a woman from the Middle East that actually I was not oppressed, and actually I was quite free to take my own decisions and all these things. So this was a second type of bias. The third type of bias was more related to working in tech. As you know, Smita, tech is one of these domains where the disparity between like men and women, unfortunately, is still very big. And even in big tech companies, like where I work, where like there are very targeted efforts around diversity and inclusion, if you look into technical positions, the gap between men and women is still quite significant. Um, so being a woman working in tech, I did experience in my previous experiences, like I worked in the Netherlands before and I did the PhD before in France. I did feel in many instances forms of biases, like people kind of not really believing that I work in a very technical position, or even in meetings like addressing my manager instead of addressing me. And for instance, if they have a question, or let's say like a request for some analysis or some work to be done, they would always CC my manager, because like they feel like, oh, she must not be accountable enough. So I did encounter many biases like this, especially when I started a new position, and especially in the instance that I was kind of like really young. So this mixture of being foreign and young and woman really like did put me in some like awkward situations. Like I remember once walking into a meeting room, and it was full of men, middle aged, or like even older, and like they literally told me that we think you're in the wrong room. Like they didn't think I got into the right room. So yeah, I mean, these kind of biases definitely exist. So I would say these are like the three big biases I did
So
experience.
that's really interesting, Gita, because I've, as you said, there are three different things, and I'm just for the listeners and for my own sake, I'm
Yeah,
kind of recapping my understanding. One, I think, is what I call a very powerful, instinctive, unconscious, positive bias, and
yeah,
that is about how we are all brought up.
mm,
How we are brought up impacts on how we see the world. Now,
yeah,
you had the privilege of being brought up by your parents in a non denominational, agnostic, liberal,
yeah,
secular, encouraging, accepting family.
yeah,
Therefore, you assumed your unconscious bias was surely the world is exactly how I know the world.
exactly.
And
Yeah,
that is how we all see it. And then you arrived at university and shock horror.
mhm,
That world was completely different from that lovely, beautiful world that you had grown up in. So
yeah,
that is such a powerful story. And I'm just kind of breaking up the wonderful different things that you've shared with us,
yeah,
because all of us will look back on our upbringing and our childhood, and hopefully the listeners are thinking about their own upbringing when they're hearing your story and thinking, oh yes, and this is how I was brought up, and that's obviously why I am thinking XYZ. I didn't even know it was an unconscious bias. That's your power. That's good for you. And of course,
yeah,
it also helps you in your own identity, because you were very confident in your identity, but you were questioned when you went to university. Then, of course, the other very, very interesting, and so obvious and continues to be, is about the gender and the age. So here you are working, you are a young person, and you are seen both as a young person and as a woman. And therefore, surely we can't be asking you the answers to certain questions, even if we know that, we might think you have it, but you can't be good enough. It's very interesting. And then, of course, which is about what you were saying earlier on, when we were talking about what is unconscious bias, and we were talking about communities and groups, and whether it's football teams or whether it's entire countries. The fact that Lebanon is a country that is extremely mixed and
mm,
has a number of religions and cultural differences within one little country, yet people abroad don't seem to understand that and make
Yeah,
assumptions based on whatever little they understand of it, and therefore expect you to fall into a particular pattern of behavior or looks or dress. So, three
yeah.
very unusual, but three very, very different aspects of unconscious bias. Um, but tell me a little bit more, Geeta. Tell us, not just me, tell us, the listeners, a little bit more. So, um, tell us a little bit more about perhaps work and what kind of learning you've taken away from that in terms of unconscious biases. You were talking about when you came from Lebanon. I remember this conversation we had the
Mm,
last time we spoke,
yeah,
and about managers and what a manager should look like. So
yeah.
tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I have yeah, we talked about this actually last time, Smita, about some unconscious biases that I found myself guilty of. So like I moved to London for a job in a big tech company, a Silicon Valley based company, and one of the good things really about this company is that there are some mandatory trainings, soft trainings that we all need to take, and one of them is about unconscious bias. Actually, it's a full day training, and during this training, we had the opportunity to really reflect not only around biases that others subject us to, but also biases that we have, even if we have like the best intentions in the world, and even if we are ourselves subject to some biases, we could still have our own biases and subjects other to. So, in the process of this training, Smita, I discovered that I had actually few biases that were still there in me, but at least now I'm aware of them. One of them is related to the role of a manager. So if you ask me like 1 2 years back, like, Gida, do you ever want to become a manager? I say no, no, absolutely not. Like, I had this kind of slightly negative connotation for the role of a manager. I associated it with being bossy, with telling people what to do, with sometimes pushing them to do stuff that they don't particularly enjoy. Not exactly exploitation, but maybe like using people to get to where you want, something like that. And with time, I kind of realized that this was like a very, very like wrong definition of a manager. A manager, a good manager, is actually a leader who empowers other, who brings out the best in others. And actually, a good or great manager is someone who would never tell you what to do. It's someone who would just like give you the space and the confidence and the delegation and trust for you to articulate what you want to work on. And one thing that my manager told me, and that really kind of hit a chord in me, as I say, was like, we take so much time to hire really good people, so that these people are better than us, and so that these people tell us what we want to work on. We don't do this so we tell them what to do. They should tell us what to do. This is why, if you are a good manager, you should be confident enough to go and chase and hire people who are better than you, who are going to tell you what to do, and not the other way around. And I feel like, yeah, I had like this big bias around being a manager, and just like, I think I've flipped it around right now, and I realized that I was hugely mistaken.
That's great because it began to make me think that I wonder growing up. Maybe you'd seen a movie, maybe you knew of somebody who
Yeah,
you didn't have high regard for, whose job title was manager.
yeah,
There are some stories, it's our stories that impact on how we view the world. We already talked about that. And
yeah,
so your life stories, wherever at some point this idea of manager could have come from somewhere, and based on that maybe one experience, you had these assumptions that managers should look like this and should behave like this, and oh, I don't ever want to be a manager because that's not my personality. I don't like
exactly.
to control. I don't want to, and that obviously, as you and I both know, does not make a good manager at all. So
Yeah,
that is so interesting because not only have you recognized that here again, because you had open conversation within a work-based training room, that you have an unconscious bias because it was unconscious until that particular
yeah,
point in time, but you've begun to reflect, you began to think, and I suspect if you have time to reflect some more, not that it's very relevant for this conversation, you might even be able to find out Aha, I remember what happened when I was 8. Somebody came who was a manager. I'm just making it up. And I understand why I thought managers were like so.
Yeah.
So that is really very, very, very interesting, because certainly many of the listeners who are listening in maybe, will be holding jobs down, who may be a manager themselves or are managing other people. And it doesn't matter what our work exactly is, but it is about the whole idea of people and human beings, and the power that you learned because of somebody saying to you that if I hire somebody, I want them to be better than me, so
Yep.
they can do the job well. Now that is empowering another human being, and unless we are not aware, unless we become aware of our own unconscious biases, it's very difficult to empower somebody else. So, certainly, the one
Exactly.
plus that I have taken away from this story that you've shared with us is that we need to reflect, and we need to understand, oh, this is why I have this unconscious bias. I need to understand why I have it, and I need to do something about it. Fascinating, fascinating, Gita. Any other lovely stories you can share with us? So you arrived, if I remember correctly, to the United Kingdom, and I don't remember how old you were, but at that point you did not speak English. Am I correct? Could you tell
No,
us a little bit more about that?
yeah, sure, Smita. So actually, I arrived to the United Kingdom 2 years and a half back. Um, yeah, and I did speak like I would say like very very decent English. But actually, when I left my home country, Lebanon, so this was like around 12 years back. I didn't speak much English, to be honest. And although I went to France, so I already was in a French system, and my mom is a French teacher, so my exposure to French was quite good. I realized soon that as I wanted to do a PhD, I needed to kind of have like a really good level of English, which I didn't. And I had to work very hard on myself to be able to kind of acquire this level that would allow me to like write articles and go and present in conferences and seminars and so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, it was not an easy journey in the beginning. It was like very intimidating at many points, because you needed to prepare everything, and you needed to be like, like to know a little bit by heart what are you going to say, because you don't have this confidence in the language. But like I worked on myself, and now I think my English is quite good. I still have this accent, but it's fine. Yeah, so this was also like actually like the language, I would say, and the accent, not only the language, because you could have a complete control over language, but your accent is not completely the local accent, and this can subject you to a little bit of biases. But then I say, like, I always, like, when I feel that someone is kind of alluding to the fact that my accent is different, I always try to tell them that an accent is always a proof that you do speak many languages, and this in itself is a great privilege, and is really like an opportunity, really. If you're able to speak many languages, this means that you're able to kind of live, I would say, maybe many lives, or be immersed in many identities, and this in itself is a very rich experience. This is what makes up interesting life.
That's so powerful. There are a couple of things here you've said, which I again I want to recap for myself and for the
Yeah.
listeners. And one, of course, is the idea of an accent and what is an accent. Well, to
Yeah.
begin with, all human beings anywhere in the world will have an accent,
Yeah.
whatever language they speak. But yet, so many people have an unconscious bias connotation that if you don't speak the way I speak, then you cannot be as good as me. It comes
Yep.
back to the right at the beginning, what you were talking about, because here too, accent comes in. I mean, I have an Indian accent, and I'm assuming that you have a Lebanese accent, but
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have a command of the language. Um, so that I think is very interesting, because I have read and heard and spoken to many people in the United Kingdom who are born and brought up in the country, let's call it England, not even Wales or Scotland or
Mhm.
Ireland, born and
Mm.
brought up in England, and come from the north of England to the south of England to London to work. And they are not accepted because of their accent.
Yes.
And they are born and brought up English. So think about that. And then So these are unfortunately society, and society is the way it is. We can't change the society. We can only change ourselves. We have that. But the other thing that I want to flag up is your incredible sense of self belief, that you felt that you could learn the language 2.5 years ago. Listeners, please notice 2.5 years ago, Ghida could not speak much English. And listen to the conversation that she and I are having right now. And what is that about? And that again comes down to our upbringing, to our sense of identity, to how we see ourselves. And of course, for that, we need to firstly thank your upbringing and your parents, and then, of course, your own self reflection and how you have chosen to do and achieve how much you have in such a short period of time. So, what else, Ghida? What kind of advice can you give us learners? You have achieved a lot in very few years. You were in Lebanon just 11 years ago, age 19, and you are now in London, working for a Silicon Valley firm, and you are also have spoken at TED Talks. You have you're an entrepreneur. You have there's a whole list of things that you have done and you continue to do. Including being a stand-up, which I think is wonderful, and I look forward to coming and hearing you at some point.
Yeah,
But
I'd love to.
looking back, what kind of advice can you give us? Can you give me? Can you give our listeners? What learning have you taken away from your experience that you feel we can also relate to?
Yeah, definitely. So Smita, just like a small correction. So like when I came to the UK 2 years back, 2 years and a half back, I did speak like decent English, I would say. But when I came to France, like around 12 years back, I didn't speak any English at all. And then by the time I left, like I would say 5 to 6 years back, I did speak like good English. But yeah, I didn't grow up speaking English till like I would say my early 20s or something like that. Now coming back to the main takeaways or the advice that I would give, I would say like be really humble in terms of like knowing that you too could have many unconscious biases toward others. Being a good human being and having the best intentions in the world, and being yourself someone who is subject to all forms of biases doesn't make you immune to being biased against others. So be humble in the sense if you feel that someone's give you either a direct or indirect feedback around like you subjecting them to some bias or you having some opinion of them that is not really rooted in truth, be open to it and be open to kind of question yourself. Now, from the other side, if you are subject to unconscious bias, like just like try to spot it and try to know that this behavior that you are being subject to has nothing to do with your performance or your character or your values. It's more about the person in front of you. You can always try to have a conversation with this person, and try to make them change their mind, but also be aware that some biases are just like very, very hard to change. And the more we talk about them, the more they become self-fulfilling. Like stereotypes are kind of self-fulfilling. So the more you talk about them, the more like they are likely to be fixed in the minds of and hearts of people. Just know that these are biases and they don't make the person good or bad, but at the same time these biases should not make you feel good or bad about yourself. um, be more confident with who you are and in peace with who you are, and just like do your best to be the best version of yourself, and then the world would adjust to you eventually.
Ah, that's so powerful. And I'm glad that you were able to talk about two aspects of unconscious bias. What should I do about my own unconscious biases?
Yeah,
And what should I do when somebody out there says something to me
yeah,
because of their unconscious biases? And your sentence, be the best person that you can be. And
yeah.
it is really about being humble. So very powerful, so very simple. And that is why so very powerful.
Thank you.
Gita, thank you so very much for having this conversation with me on the unconscious bias. I know the listeners would have taken away a lot as I have, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you, Gita.
Thank you so much, Smita. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. If you enjoyed hearing this episode, do tune in every Saturday for a new interview. And if you could share, leave a review and rating, that would be hugely appreciated. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter @Smita Tharoor, and feel free to suggest new guests. Until next week.